If we were able to clone the people we love after they passed away, what might happen? Watch this space to see what transpires. A stunning young bride in her wedding gown and her much older husband, the young woman, are being driven by a couple in an opulent sedan up a winding mountain road. Elizabeth is overjoyed as her husband Henry whisks her away into a fantasy world where there are no problems and where they end up. A splendid home tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by tall trees and a crystal-clear sky. Oliver, a young man, and Claire, the housekeeper, welcome them when they arrive. Elizabeth is drawn in by the splendor of the home, its expansive glass windows, its warm interiors, and the calm tranquility that permeates the entryway. Oliver's blindness becomes immediately apparent to her when she notices beautiful flowers, white orchids, and lies. That evening, the pair is treated to a sumptuous supper, which is attended by well-mannered servants. Romance and affection bring the evening to a close. The following morning, Henry shows Elizabeth throughout the mansion with pride, bragging about its lavish furnishings, artwork, and paintings. There is even a beautiful wardrobe filled with fashionable dresses, particularly for her. The arrangement of the house is captivating, with every area growing in beauty. Identifying the biometric locks on every door, Henry explains that they are set up specifically for him and her. Elizabeth notices a frosted glass door during their tour and inquires about it inquisitively. She objects, but Henry firmly tells her that the biometric system will keep her from accessing it, so she shouldn't enter. Nevertheless, Elizabeth is left alone for their honeymoon when Henry departs the following day on a business trip, leaving her to face the pain of loneliness. She reluctantly asks CLA how long she has worked there as she swims and looks around the house. She also wonders out loud as to why Henry, a well-known man, would marry someone so unremarkable. Elizabeth spends her day finding distractions, while CLA avoids answering. That evening, while reading, trying on outfits, and dancing, she notices CLA and Oliver leave the house as the night wears on. Elizabeth, suffering from sleeplessness, starts inadvertently exploring the estate and ends up in the forbidden room. Her fear overcomes her curiosity, and it gets the better of her. After inadvertently tipping over a table and hurting her finger on the glass, Elizabeth leaves the room. Henry gets home in the morning. Elizabeth is distracted, so he plays the piano for her, but he soon realizes this. Elizabeth plays it off as an accident when he asks what happened after seeing her bandaged finger, but Henry quickly accuses her of lying, frightening her with his composed manner. Elizabeth tries to carry on as usual, but that evening she is startled by her husband's sharp observation. She is caught by Henry creeping about the home, and he confronts her for going inside the prohibited room against his wishes. Henry maintains that Elizabeth's disobedience is the only problem, despite Elizabeth's attempts to refute it. She tries to run away, terrified, but the house is locked. Henry chases after her, eventually catching up, shoving her violently down the steps and then hitting her with a metal weapon. The following scene features Oliver, CLA, and Henry excavating a grave in the Y and lowering Elizabeth's body into it. While CLA is relieved it's over, Henry warns it's not. 6 weeks later, the cycle is restarted when Henry shows up with an Elizabeth clone. Same exchanges of words, same deeds. As the days go by, Elizabeth swears to Henry once more that she will not go into the forbidden room. Elizabeth regains her curiosity, and one night she finds Clary in the kitchen. She starts talking to Clary in an attempt to learn more about her circumstances. Clara gives a hint, but Henry cuts her off before she can say anything more, and leads Elizabeth back to their bedroom. The following day, Henry tells Elizabeth to behave herself and leaves the house. Elizabeth goes through the home once more, crying out for Oliver and CLA but getting no answer. She swims, plays the piano, and puts on more outfits because she's bored, but eventually, the lure of the forbidden room gets to her. When Elizabeth re-enters the room, she finds more terrifying secrets and screams in fear. That night, she experiences a nightmare in which she is approached by the girl from the glass capsule who is exactly like her when she emerges from her chamber. When Henry comes back, he sees Elizabeth's dread. Henry notices that she has defied him once more as she withdraws to the restroom. Out of despair and rage, he starts to choke her. Elizabeth kicks him and gets away from a panicked Chase, who breaks out in the kitchen of the mansion. Henry holds onto a cloth drenched in ether, while Elizabeth armed herself with blades. He entices her with music while he plays the piano, but it's a trap, a recording. Just as it looks like everything is gone, Henry sneaks up behind her and presses the handkerchief to her face. After Elizabeth stabs him, they fall into a pool of blood. When Elizabeth wakes up, she discovers that Henry is dead, and she is living. She tidies up the situation, disposing of his body and wrapping it. She tries to call emergency services but doesn't know the address at the moment and burns her bloodied clothing in the house elevator. Elizabeth's survival astounded CLA and Oliver when they returned. She pretends everything is okay, pretending that Henry is resting upstairs. Elizabeth is about to depart when CLA suddenly passes out with a heart attack, begging for assistance before being whisked away by an ambulance. Elizabeth tries to explain that killing Henry was an act of self-defense, but Oliver tells her not to walk outside and that he cannot protect her if she does. Oliver comforts her, saying he hated Henry too and will assist her in getting rid of the body. But as they get to know one another better, Dean's Oliver discloses that Elizabeth is a clone, one of 6 identical copies of Henry's late wife. Elizabeth's world collapses upon learning the truth, leaving her in shock. CLA was a renowned geneticist before she began working with Henry. She initially met Oliver at his residence, and it wasn't long before she learned of the terrifying truth of Henry's experiments. His terrible love tale unfolded. Oliver was born, and Henry's wife died shortly after, from a rare genetic illness that caused her cells to rapidly degenerate after she died. Henry had cloned his wife, generating 6 clones, but the sickness lingered in them too. He built cryogenic chambers to hold the clones' bodies in stasis in order to slow down the procedure. By the time CLA joined the project, only 4 clones remained. Henry attempted playing music and records to the clones in an attempt to jog their memory while CLA went to work trying to decipher the gene causing the illness. And yet the most recent clone emerged, in spite of him. Elizabeth was unable to recall much more than fleeting experiences, which one day left her disoriented and increasingly frustrated. Fearing for her life, Elizabeth fled into the lab and was apprehended by the police, who then returned her to Henry's house. The CLA rejected Elizabeth's claims that she was suffering from a mental illness and acknowledged her as her sick niece. Oliver interrupts Elizabeth while she is reading when he brings her dinner and gives her a warning to behave. He takes advantage of the opportunity to attack Elizabeth and demands the code to open the door. Oliver hands it to her with reluctance. Oliver is working on the body of another Elizabeth clone when she rushes to the lab. She is sent into a delirium as he asks her to assist in holding up the clone's head, seeing images of the previous clone's memories. Elizabeth passes out when she wakes up. Despite being helpless and shackled to a bed, she is adamant about continuing to read the pages of Claw's diary. Claire observes the neurological deterioration of the clone, which provides insight into the project's downfall. After years of futile attempts, Henry was desperate, but Claire saw him not as a scientist, but rather as a lover lost in his sorrow. Oliver questions Elizabeth about Claire's writing about him as he enters the room again. After the 3rd clone died, Elizabeth reveals that Claire had an affair with Henry without realizing that Henry had tampered with the genetic samples. The illness had been stopped by CLA, leaving the final healthy clones. Oliver then talks about his own experiences, mentioning how he used to think Elizabeth was quite beautiful. Henry, who was able to see back then, lost his sight when Oliver departed because he was jealous of Oliver's intimacy with Elizabeth. Elizabeth keeps reading the journal. Claire wrote that she broke up with Henry because she couldn't stand up to his infatuation with Elizabeth. Henry's affection, though, was only concerned with making his lost wife look like herself. Claire was shocked to learn that Oliver was actually a clone of Henry, made out of worry that Elizabeth wouldn't love him as he grew older rather than Henry's son. The next morning, Elizabeth wakes to the cold sensation of scissors at her neck. Oliver insists that she show him what Claire has written about him. She acknowledges that Claire thought he was a Henry clone. Oliver furiously disputes that, citing a birth certificate as evidence. When he approaches, filled with want, Elizabeth invites him closer and asks him sensually if he loves her. She overwhelms him and uses her shackles to choke him. She insists that he hand over the keys to her and release the restraints. Elizabeth comes into the room brandishing a gun. Staring at each other, the two clones are exact replicas of one another. Oliver attempts to persuade the visitor that Elizabeth in the room is dangerous and ill, but Elizabeth V counters that they are both prisoners and submits to Oliver. Although Elizabeth tells her counterpart to lie down, she mistakenly kills Oliver when the sixth clone fires, killing him and injuring the fifth, resilient clone. Elizabeth leaves the house. Her mind whirls with all the memories of her forebears, blending together in a disorienting way. A muffled gunshot echoes in the distance. The fifth clone passes away, her vision dimming as she sees her identical self standing over her morning arrival, the sixth Elizabeth having shot her double, and the last surviving Elizabeth reads Claw's diary one last time in the concluding entry. Henry leaves Claire all of his belongings, saying that he never meant to kill Elizabeth, and that all he wanted was for her to return. However, in the process of bringing her back, he experienced an odd joy and kept seeing Elizabeth die, believing that the only way he could truly feel these incarnations of Elizabeth were real was by destroying them. Elizabeth is reading when a cab arrives at the home and CLA gets out. When they first meet at the entrance, Elizabeth gives Claire everything because she thinks Claire deserves it. Elizabeth thinks back on the guy who had won her heart and carried her away from all of life's sorrows as she leaves the house and all of its horrors behind. However, she is no longer dreaming. She is finally awake.